Good morning. This is John Kinch. I'm with Michigan Energy Options. We're a clean energy nonprofit in the state of Michigan. I am super excited today to have a conversation with Lottie Schlegel about some things that she and I have talked about in the past, which is really about how we can use our building sector as a way to drive a clean energy economy. So she's going to introduce herself here in a few. Let me talk to you, though, about this series we do every winter and every summer. This is the first of the summer of 2020, talking to Lottie. We have a couple more coming up later on this summer, one of which is with my friend Jacob Corviday of Rocky Mountain Institute. Jacob is a Michigan guy, and in July we're going to be talking about the carbon economy and how we incorporate that more, I think, into how we're trying to drive clean energy transformation in our communities. The third conversation later this summer is with Carrie O'Neill and John D'Agostino of Inclusive Prosperity Capital. And we're going to talk with them about how we finance projects, especially given the economic times we find ourselves in. There's more information about both of those upcoming webinars on our website. In terms of the logistics of this webinar, Lottie's going to do a brief presentation about her work, and then she and I are going to have a conversation, but we want it to be a group conversation. So there's a question mark in your side panel there that you can click on, and you can put a question in the box. And Tom Gilman of Michigan Energy Options will curate those, and he'll ask those questions as we go along in our conversation, and also understand that we'll save some time at the end for question and answer as well. We have about 45 minutes together this morning. So I've met with IMT a couple times in their offices on L Street there in the Beltway in DC, and I was actually scheduled to meet with Lottie and company this March, but of course the world changed, so we were able to get on a virtual conference like we're doing kind of here today and talk about some of those issues that we have in common. We have done some work indirectly with IMT a couple times. Most recently, we did some work for the Small Business Association of Michigan, doing a number of energy audits of small businesses as a way to encourage them to then move forward in doing some upgrades of their properties. What I think I like the most about what IMT is about the market transformation piece, because that is critical for that public and private piece to work together so that we can see more change in our built environments and have it change that actually has a return on investment for people. So it isn't just a case of somebody doing something because it feels good, but it actually makes good economic sense. So with that, I'm going to let Lottie introduce herself. She's going to show us some slides of IMT's work, and then she and I are going to have a conversation. Thank you.
Good morning, John, and I'm so glad to be talking with you this morning and in conversation with the Michigan Energy Options network of people. The work I think that your community is doing to promote health and economic development and resilience in the clean energy transition is really important and really impressive. And one of the things that really strikes me about the opportunity of today is that we're in a moment where we have an enormous capacity for change. So while the COVID-19 pandemic and the visible murders of Black Americans are shining bright spotlights on ways that our systems aren't working for our people, I think as a community of people working in clean energy, we understand that climate change will create additional disruption and intensify inequality. So I think as a community of people working in clean energy, we've seen in the last few months how rapidly and profoundly we can alter our lives and businesses in bad ways and good, and how much we can learn and adapt. And this gives me hope that it's networks of people like this one on our call today who can seize the opportunity and be armed with an understanding of what we can do to support change, working across disciplines on some of the biggest adaptive challenges of human history. So IMT is all about this. We are about changing business as usual. So as John said, we bring the governmental and business structures together to achieve high-performing buildings that work for us all. What makes us effective in doing that is our ability to bridge the vision of a low-carbon future while being grounded in market reality, and increasingly in this day and age, human reality as well. So in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of leadership and innovation in business, in technology, and in policy. And we have, in this moment of time, all of the building blocks that we need for significant transformation in making our buildings work for us. And the next decade is all about how do we actually make that happen. So we're talking about cities today because a lot of innovation in the last 10 years has been local, at the community level and at the city leadership level. Many state governments have a commitment to address efficiency, clean energy. Many of them are building a plan on how to adapt to climate change. And at the same time, local government leaders at the city level are really focused on climate action and preparedness as well, understanding that the things that they try and the local actions that they take can create a wave of change and serve as models for broader action for the country and for businesses across America. So I often like to take a step back and think about why do we care about buildings and what is the role of buildings in this clean energy transition. And I'd like to invite each of you to take a minute to think about your community, maybe your life, the people that you love, what the buildings in your life, and think about what matters to you. When I do this, I reflect on the ways in which my family is really is like most of our life is focused in buildings. 90% of the time that humans spend, maybe except for John, who's like out paddling all the time, but 90% of our time is spent indoors. And it matters to me where my children are in school, or where my parents are living, and that those buildings are healthy, that they're safe, and that they're really making their lives better. The pandemic has made me really reflect on this quite a bit, like why buildings matter to us. We're spending so much time of our time indoors. I live in Washington, D.C., and my neighbor, Sophia, is someone who lives in a pretty big apartment building with a lot of people in her apartment. She's working in a grocery store during the day. So she's spending all of her time in buildings, in part because there's no other spaces around us in the city to be outdoors, because all of our parks have been closed. There's very limited options for us. So the health of those buildings, the air quality in those buildings really matter in terms of her ability to thrive and her family's ability to thrive. I think that's some of the reasons that buildings really matter, and the connection to energy and the performance from an energy perspective is so clear here. The energy that our buildings consume contribute 38% of our national greenhouse gas emissions. So that brings us to a lot of the reasons why cities are taking action on buildings. A lot of IMT's work in the past 10 years has focused on cities and metro areas, in part because there's a lot of buildings in these areas and there's a lot of political will. So in the last 10 years, we've supported about 100 local governments to take action on buildings. One of our flagship projects is the City Energy Project, which is developing a model of city and local business leadership to really develop the capacity within our cities to address building improvements. So I want to give you a couple of examples of some of the cities that we've worked with, and some of the leadership that they have provided, and the innovation that they've led in the last couple of years. So for cities, a lot of the reason why they take action on buildings is because buildings are big drivers of pollution and also big drivers of economic growth. So as John mentioned, with the work with businesses, for many businesses, energy can be a big driver of cost. So being able to reduce those costs is a really important way to help people spend money on things that they need to do to drive growth in their business. So the first city I wanted to talk about is Salt Lake City. So Salt Lake City took action on buildings because of public health. They're in a valley, and pollution is a big deal, and air quality is a big deal. And there's an economic connection there as well. So when you think about attracting businesses to your city and making your city a wonderful place for your residents, you want people to have sort of healthy air quality and all of the kind of access of the kind of benefits of the place where you live in. So they took action on buildings because they were contributing 40% of the air pollution to the city through the energy that the people in the buildings were using. So what they did was they brought a number of local business, nonprofit, and government leaders together. And one of the ways they decided to take action through policy was through a benchmarking and transparency law. So they passed in 2015 a law that required the owners and operators of large buildings used for commercial business measure and report their energy use to the city. And that enabled the city to help direct people to utility programs, other city programs that would enable them to make improvements. And it also allowed them to recognize the leaders in their city for making improvements and for having healthy buildings in the city. So for them, the results it's still kind of early for them, but the results are that many of their public buildings were improved over the first couple of years. And the city recognized the leaders who are owning and operating the best performing buildings. And they've been able to connect those that waste a lot of energy with programs to tune up their buildings or invest in upgrades to their buildings. So that's the first example where we're really seeing one of the reasons cities are focusing on buildings is because of public health. A second example is really that sort of economic driver, the jobs, reducing costs for people in businesses, and industry development. So my second example is St. Louis, Missouri. They also, in addition to wanting to really focus on the economic angle of buildings and the energy industry, they also had a carbon neutrality pledge, and they realized that they would have to address building performance if they were to meet some of their carbon goals. So they passed a building performance standard earlier this year. And what this is a mechanism that basically targets increased performance for different aspects of the building over time. So going from just thinking about the codes that we use when we construct buildings to thinking about the performance of the building over time from an energy and a carbon perspective. It's a really different way to think about it. What they're able to do is work through the performance standard to kind of complement their building energy codes and those things work in tandem to improve the performance of the building stock over time. So the building performance standard applies to a broad swath of buildings, even when they're not pulling permits. And from a building owner perspective, the performance standard provides the flexibility to decide what upgrades they want to make over time to be able to meet the increasingly stringent standards over time. So it gives that flexibility for people to make decisions that are most effective and economical to be able to meet the target. So while I'm talking about a government policy that was passed in St. Louis, it's also important to note that this is really something that a company can do for themselves in the absence of policy. That many companies have set improvement targets for themselves over time because if their operations, as you know, are really energy intensive, there can be a real benefit to improving operations over time, particularly in the commercial buildings where there's some sort of manufacturing or heavy process happening in the building. So what's next for them, this was a policy that was just passed. So what's next for them is to really focus on, well, how do they implement this, and how do they make sure that they're achieving the jobs and the economic benefits that they want to achieve over time. My third example is I wanted to give a Michigan city, it's Grand Rapids, which has been focused on improving the quality of life for citizens. So making improvements in buildings to promote health and increase affordability and quality of homes. They were part of a project that is not an IMT project, but a project called the Zero Cities Project, which was moving to build net zero carbon emissions in buildings, including in homes. And I'm bringing up this example not just because it's a Michigan example, but because I believe it's a snapshot of one of the trends that we'll see in the next decade in city action on buildings and policy. Equity is becoming an increasing concern for the city government level, and certainly at the community level. And I think we are entering a period of time where we're going to be able to overlay building performance information like utility usage information with other information and data that the city has, so that we can more effectively geo-target programs, for example, or improvements in our investments in our building stock. And I think this opens up a pretty exciting opportunity for us as a community to think about what are some of the outcomes that we want to achieve through our building stock, and also how can we get there? Like one of the things about energy efficiency that I've found maddening over the course of my time in this industry is, it makes sense and it's hard to get people to do it. And so I think really what's next, now that we have the technology, the know-how on the business case side, the knowledge in our communities, a really great set of industry partners, really focusing on how do we actually most get to scale, to be able to realize the potential that buildings have to enable the clean energy transition. And I'll stop there because I think there's quite a few things that we could talk about along that vein. And I don't want to be talking at you. I'd prefer to be in conversation with you. That's sort of the introduction today for why cities and why buildings as part of the action that we're taking.
Excellent. Thank you, Lottie. Let's move into more of the Q&A and the conversation piece. So again, just to reiterate, we have a icon that looks like a question mark, and it is. And there you can click on that and put your questions into the box, and we'll ask those along the way. Meanwhile, Lottie and I will turn on our video cameras, which is what pretty much all of us do anymore, and say hello. There she is. Hello. Thanks. Can you hear me okay, Lottie? Can't hear you.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so you said so many wonderful, interesting things. I don't know where to start, but couple things. You're talking about the health, the economics, and the equity pieces of our cities and how those can be drivers. And it seems to me if you roll those all up together, you've got something along the lines of resiliency. So maybe we could talk about that. You talked about policy and also proof of concept of projects, and maybe we could talk about that dynamic. Our work, MIO's work, tends to be kind of trying to drive proof of concept projects that might lead themselves then to better policy, but it can also certainly work the other way around. And you spoke about leadership. You spoke about how government leadership and also business leadership in our cities, our communities, is important. We happen to have in Grand Rapids the West Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, which is really a mix of those two sectors as well as nonprofits, and we're a member of that group. And I think it's a great forum to have opportunities to discuss things like we're talking about here today. So do any of those three strike you as most interesting to take a bite into?
Yeah, let's take from the top.
Okay. So I think one of the things is that, that it's not one size fits all when it comes to building performance and clean energy and all the rest. If folks are motivated by any number of reasons to suddenly want to invest in a property. So what are you seeing across the country? Is there a particular, you mentioned the affordable housing and quality of life here for Grand Rapids, but also folks looking for an ROI. And then of course, given the pandemic, health is being something which is very much ratcheting up in people's consciousness. Are you seeing any kind of trends among those three? Is one dominating, or is it a case that sometimes all three come together to drive change?
Yeah, I mean, I think all three can come together, and that's where the real potential is thinking through what it is that we want to be, like what are we using our buildings for, right? What do we need them to do for us? And how do we make and prioritize our investments according to what we're doing? So right now, I think obviously health is a big driver for a lot of people because frankly, depending on where you are in the country, many people are kind of worried about, is this building going to make me sick? Is it going to, am I going to be breathing air in the building that that everybody else has been breathing out into? And so I think that's something that we're seeing a lot with in larger buildings and real estate portfolios, is people making sure that they have that indoor air quality as part of the component of the building operations, which can have an energy trade-off, but doesn't have to. It's possible. I don't know. One of the things that always strikes me when I walk into a really high-performing building that's pulling in filtered outdoor air, it's comfortable and you feel, awake and able to focus. And you're, in many cases, the buildings that are really well insulated are quiet. You hear that, I live in a city, so there's always kind of sirens or helicopters or whatever, and you're inside the building and it's quiet and you're able to focus, right? There's some of these benefits, I think, are things that we don't necessarily think of when we think of buildings and high performing buildings. And I think those are some of the things that we're missing out on by not having a high performing building. So I think it's just sort of like, what is that environment that you want to be living in or working or playing in or learning in?
Yeah, certainly health and safety have become a top line message these days about our buildings. The West Michigan USGBC has put on some really interesting webinars over the last couple months, and indoor air quality I've been schooled up about how important it is and how oftentimes it does lack in our buildings. We might be thinking about insulation and any number of things like that, but the indoor air quality, I think, is going to be increasingly that thing that's going to either make people feel safe or not coming into a commercial building. So what about proof of concept? I always think of you folks as doing kind of both, and policy, doing both well at the same time, that you drive projects on the ground and to see results, but also you're working with Cliff, for example, on the GR side of things and working on policy. How do those two interact with each other at IMT?
Yeah, Yeah, I think there's a lot of, in many different building sectors as well, in residential and commercial, there's a lot of questions around the business case and then the know-how for how to build a building, right? And this is part of what I think is important to understand, is like we have the technology to make all of our buildings really low energy and really comfortable with great air quality, but we're not doing that. And so in many cases, we're trying to shine a spotlight on things that work, and things that from a business perspective, and things that can get to scale. And one of the things that any kind of business owner knows is that when you do something for the first time, you have to figure out all the details. But then once you know how to do it, it becomes easier with time. And so I think just being able to spotlight, hey, the business case, for example, for passive house affordable housing that has on-site renewables, or potentially even backup storage for times of when the power may go out, or there's real importance to have an energy resilience aspect of the building. The business case for that, for many parts of that, is already in front of us, is already here. And so the question is then, how do you actually get that to scale within a community, within even a business, so that if you're in the construction industry, or the HVAC industry, you're all about ventilation. You know how to install that equipment effectively and well every time, and making it part of your business as usual. And I think that's been a lot of people have figured that out, figured out that business case. So that's a big part of what we're trying to highlight, and be able to build those pathways to actually getting to scale for those sorts of to be able to actually build and operate high-performing buildings.
I think what's interesting,
and in many cases, the costs are there. The business case is there. Yeah.
Well, I think the business case in part comes from smart technologies, and from, and you and I are both interested in this notion that a building can become an asset on the grid. It can become a DER. It can become something that you can use to balance load locally. Do you want to talk a bit about more
Absolutely.
in that area, if you guys are doing anything kind of cool?
Yeah, well, I think there's just thinking about the concept of grid integrated efficient buildings, right? And I know the utilities in Michigan in many cases are kind of out ahead on this, just thinking about EVs and how EVs connect with buildings as well. But one of the trends that I think is worth following is electrification, the trends that heating and water heating, and in some cases cooking, are now able to be done efficiently using electricity rather than burning gas or propane or oil in the building. And that's a bit of a shift. So burning fuel on site in a building has been more efficient and cheaper for the last few decades. And I think part of what makes people really interested in electrification as a strategy in buildings is the ability to now generate electricity more cleanly, the increasing ability to store energy either like thermally by keeping the building at a consistent temperature, or using things like water tanks, or electrically in batteries in a building or in vehicles that are attached to the building. This technology is getting more and more effective over time. And so that, combined with the ability to control electric use more dynamically, it just enables people to think about how is the building part of the broader electric grid, and how can we think about how all these things work together and actually operationalize it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I know IMG does a little bit of this kind of work, or pays attention to it, but it's not necessarily your core. And that's the idea of on-site solar, or at least solar somewhere nearby, like in a community solar park, Or the other piece of
Yep.
this, of course, is that how many of those electrons are green and how many of those are black that are powering electrification, whether it's an EV or whether it's a building, and that's has everything to do with
Yeah.
state policy and what the utilities are doing in terms of adding renewables to their energy mix, their fuel mix.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
and there's parts of the country where a developer of a new building, even a large building, can make the business case and the environmental case for an all-electric building with on-site renewables. And there's other parts of the country where we're not there yet.
Right. I mean, I think the upper Midwest, where we are, at least where I am today here in DC, but as you know, I think the air source heat pumps are getting better and better all the time, and the resistance is getting better, and they work at colder temperatures. I think it's just a matter of time before that technology is really there. It's kind of already there, but it's getting better all the time. I'm going to pause here and ask my colleague Tom if he could read us some of the questions that are in the question box that I see.
Yep, so we've got quite a few questions coming in, so thanks everyone for sending those through. One that's, I think, related to what we were just discussing comes from Ron. He asks, transportation links people to buildings, so how do you tie transportation into your building view?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that I find so fascinating about buildings, is that they're hubs not only for our social systems, but for all of the other utility systems, and that we are able to think about, like, where does the transportation come in and intersect with the building? Where does the water supply, the wastewater, the energy supply connect with the building? So transportation is not something that I'm particularly expert in, but I do think it's a really important part of how we think about the building ecosystem, and particularly the energy transition in terms of storage. And I'm not even going to pretend to be an expert in this, because I feel like I'm talking to a set of people in Michigan who probably thought about this way more than anybody else. But I think that's one of the really interesting questions, is how can you have sort of this mobility, the mobile kind of energy supply? Is that, like, what would it actually take to make that work and make it make sense, given all of the other reasons we have to kind of balance demand and supply. And I think in a lot of the cities around the country have obviously really thought a lot about how to improve the efficiency of transportation, of how people are getting to and from buildings in the community. And a lot of the leadership frameworks have done a really excellent job of thinking about how to integrate the human parts of, like, getting to a building with the consequences from an energy side. I think that's going to be one of the interesting questions for some companies as a result of the pandemic that we're in, right? And a lot of people who have been, particularly in office jobs, been able to work remotely. It's like, are we going to think differently about the trade-offs of having to commute to buildings every day versus not? I'm not sure that I answered your question, but those are several points.
Tom, let me sneak a follow-up in on that, because this is certainly something we're seeing in headlines all the time, and we all ourselves are just kind of wondering about this. What happens to big cities and their commercial districts, where people may not want to necessarily return to work in cubicles or desks side by side, have concerns about the mass transit, moreover, maybe find themselves to be relatively productive working at home. Do you have any thoughts on where we're, and I know we're going to be thinking short-term and long-term both, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think this is one of the areas where I think it's just like we could be on the verge of so much change right now. And we're actually doing a small project at IMT right now, following up with a number of people who are work in real estate, just thinking through what does that look like. And we've seen in some cases kind of innovative, already kind of repurposing of buildings. I think and thinking about, for example, with the city, in places where there's a large homeless population or housing insecure population. There are a couple of examples of hotels that are no longer viable being used to increase the availability of housing in the city. So the question is, like, what is that balance? Will we see kind of an increase of, I think in the very big picture, people moving out of cities, or will we see kind of a new balancing of people wanting the benefits of being in a city and the kind of the culture and the connectedness that they get from being around a lot of people, and just making the decision to kind of stay. So I think there's a lot of cases though where you see kind of a move. Have you seen in Michigan, of course, you've seen a move out of cities, and it causes a lot of challenges to try to balance, what is it, and need to ask the question, what is it that makes a healthy, resilient community from an economic perspective as well, and a health perspective. And I think we probably have a lot to learn there, and a lot to learn in terms of how we can proactively address those changes that might happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a fast track, I think, on some of this. So Tom, ask another question, because I'm going to shut up because we're getting down to our last few minutes here. Fire away.
Cool. So as we've been discussing, the business case is getting stronger all the time for people to make improvements to their own buildings. But one of the questions that has come in is, are there any practical opportunities to gather and focus more local wealth to retrofit buildings in a local geography, given the more local benefits to occupants of those buildings?
Yeah, I was talking to someone from a community bank the other day about this very question, and I think there are a number of people who are invested in places, right? Invested in emotionally, like want to see the city thriving. And I do think there are opportunities to bring together people who understand the business case and the payback, and think about how do we actually get at the level of activity, the level of building improvement that we want to see, and how do we prioritize that? I think there's a number of models out there on the financial side, lots and lots of them, that are proven to work and make sense for everybody involved in the transaction. And the question is, how do we get that together, that will together to at a scale that makes it make sense in a community? And that's a really good question, and I'm really, that's something that I would, if for the person who asked this question, would love to talk with you more about, and hope you reach out and talk and ask some questions, because I think that's the question of the day, is how do we get that done, and what does that look like? And I think there's more than one way to get there. And I think we could see some continued real innovation in our communities across the country by having people work in different ways to test out the ways to get there.
Sure. I mean, there's things like in our state, we have a loan. Michigan Saves does loans for energy efficiency and solar. We have PACE. Then, of course, there's crowdfunding, which is tantalizing and interesting and coming on strong in other parts of the country. And then, of course, things like green banks. But you're right, all that.
Green banks, on-bill financing and repayment. There's so many mechanisms. It's just a question of, like, what is going to make sense given the community. I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and something that I don't know, I challenge all of us to really to work on and make happen in the next couple of years.
Yeah. Tom, do you have one or two more? Then we have to probably wind things up here.
Sure. Yeah. So kind of, again, a subject that we touched upon, but we've had a question that's come in to say, do you have any solutions for cities whose states have taken away their ability to require energy efficiency improvements in the building code?
Yeah, that's a real good one. There's a lot of networks of city governments. I think you have one in Michigan, John, right? Like there's that are looking, are working together. Like I would say team up with other cities and other stakeholders, because that is why do you want to be able to do this, and what do you want to be able to do? Because I think there's a lot of reasons to sort of to make. I mean, there's a business case from a government side as well, and so I think if people are really interested, and people can drive demand, cities can drive demand at the state level as well, and be happy to talk more about the specific situations there. But I know it's a big frustration, particularly in the Midwest. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there to think about, okay, well, what is it? Are there other creative mechanisms, market mechanisms that we could use to be able to achieve the end result that you're looking for in the absence of policy? And there's, I think there are models out there and could be really strong models out there to get to that direction as well.
Yeah, I agree. Tom, one last one if you got it.
Okay, sure.
By the way, Tom's accent is from Jersey, in case anybody's wondering.
So on the topic of engaging other stakeholders, what kind of connection do you see between utilities and local buildings when it comes to energy improvements?
Yeah, I think there's a really strong case for collaboration. This is something IMT has done quite a bit of work around how to effectively foster collaboration at the city level with the utility, because I think there's opportunities for mutual benefit, and we see a number of examples in cities around the country where those partnerships can be really strengthened, and particularly for utilities that have some sort of energy or clean energy programming, really strong ways to kind of collaborate to sort of improve outcomes with respect to participation in programs, and really being able to kind of fully reap the benefits of programs, and really creative ways to bring different programs together. We saw this a little bit in Michigan with the Small Business Energy Initiative, where, as you mentioned, John, there's ways to kind of stand up a program that brings in a couple of different mechanisms, both from the market side and the business side and the utility side, and really try to create something that has different results. And I think there's only gain there to really collaborate across the city government, the utility, and other stakeholders in a local community as well. I think there's lots of ways to be able to effectively leverage all of those brains and all of those resources together to be able to have some really good outcomes.
Yeah, and to be sure, we leveraged in what the utilities were offering as incentives and rebates per the statute on energy efficiency in the state, as well as those things we could put together so that as best we could, the cost to that end user, that commercial operation, was as minimum as possible.
Yeah, and we had some examples in Minnesota, for example, where they were able to leverage even other business programs, right? Like non-energy programs to help business improvement. And it takes time to build that strong connection and strong collaboration, but it can be really, really beneficial and have some really great results for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know we're right on time here. If I could just squeeze in one final question, how could we get hold of a list of the building performance standards used by St. Louis?
Of the building performance standards, so you can go to imt.org. We have a overview of building performance standards, and then there's a website that we run called buildingrating.org that does a comparison of policies. Or you can send me an email. I don't know if you have my contact is pretty easy. It's lotte@imt.org. So send me any questions you have. I'm happy to send links your way as well.
And that prompts me to provide a plug that you guys have wonderful resources that are free on your website that people can download reports and all kinds of other good stuff. And I really also want to point to your blog that you've been writing. I find it very relevant and good. When's your next entry coming out? Do you have one planned?
Yeah, usually they come out around the end of the month.
Okay, we got time. So we look forward to that. So
we've got a little time.
Oh, good. Well, Lotte, thank you so much. Good to see you again. This has been wonderful. Thanks everybody for tuning into the webinar. Happy Friday. We will see you back in July. Thank you.